I grew up in what most people would call a nice house. My dad sold farm equipment and worked his way up from nothing to build his own company. He wasn't just good at his job, he was really good. So good that we never had to worry about money. My mom was different. She never worked, but that was fine with Dad. He wanted her to enjoy the life he built for us. But being a housewife didn't mean she did much around the house. Instead, she spent her days shopping, going to salons, and meeting up with friends. Dad loved her so much that he let her do whatever she wanted, drinking with her friends, spending lots of money, and even forgetting to pick me up from school. He would just sigh and make excuses for her. I was 10 when things started to change. Dad had to go on a work trip to another state. He didn't want to go, I could tell, but he had no choice. Before leaving, I heard him talking to Mom in the kitchen. "Janet, please remember, Rachel needs to be picked up at 2:35. Set an alarm if you need to." "Brian, I'm not stupid," Mom snapped. "I can take care of my own daughter for a few days." Turns out she couldn't. The day started like any other. Dad had been gone for 3 days, and everything seemed fine. But that afternoon, when I walked out of school, Mom wasn't there. I waited for 20 minutes, then decided to walk home. It wasn't far, and I had done it before when she was late. But when I got home, something was different. The house was locked, and I didn't have a key. Our neighbor, Mrs. Brandon, was outside watering her flowers. She saw me standing there and looked uneasy. "Oh, Rachel, honey," she called out. "Your mom left a few hours ago with Emma and the others. They were talking about a wine tasting event." My stomach sank. I pulled out the emergency phone Dad had given me and tried calling Mom. No answer. I kept trying to call Mom, but she never answered. Hours passed as I sat on our front porch. When it got cold, Mrs. Brandon brought me a jacket, but Mom still didn't come home. Finally, as it got dark, I called Dad. "Daddy," my voice shook. "I'm locked out. Mom's not home, and she won't answer her phone. I'm sitting on the porch. Mrs. Brandon has been checking on me." "Okay, listen carefully," Dad said. "I'm coming home right now. Ask Mrs. Brandon if you can stay with her tonight. I'll be there as fast as I can." Mrs. Brandon let me stay in her guest room that night. I barely slept, listening for the sound of Dad's car. He arrived around 3 a.m., having driven straight through from his business trip 2 states away. He looked exhausted but determined as he thanked Mrs. Brandon and took me home. We sat in the living room, waiting. Dad told me to go to bed, but I refused. I wanted to see Mom's face when she walked in. It wasn't until 7 a.m. that we heard her car pull into the driveway. Mom stumbled through the door, her fancy dress wrinkled, her makeup smudged. She smelled like a bottle of wine. When she saw Dad sitting in his chair, her eyes went wide. "Brian, what are you doing home?" Dad's voice was quiet, but I had never heard him so angry. "Our 10-year-old daughter was locked out of the house for hours yesterday. She had to stay with the neighbors because her mother was too busy partying to remember she existed." Mom tried to laugh it off. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. Rachel's fine, aren't you, sweetheart?" She reached for me, but I pulled away. Dad stood up, so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "Fine?" She called me, crying, "Janet. She couldn't reach you for hours. What if something had happened to her?" Mom pouted. "I just lost track of time. The girls and I were having such a nice time." Dad's voice thundered through the house. "The girls? Your daughter should come before the girls and their wine tastings. What kind of mother are you?" Mom collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. It won't happen again, I promise." It took a week of Mom crying and making promises before Dad finally softened. But something had changed forever. I saw it in the way Mom looked at me when Dad wasn't around, cold, distant, like I was the problem. When Dad was home, she acted like a loving mother, hugging me, asking about my day. But the moment he turned his back, her smile disappeared.
For 8 years, it was like that.
When Dad was watching, she pretended to care. But when he wasn't, she treated me like I didn't belong in my own home. I learned to stay in my room, to keep out of the way, to avoid being alone with Mom. When I was 17, our already fragile family completely fell apart. It started when Dad got sick. At first, he was just tired and lost some weight, nothing too worrying. But then, the stomach pain started, and they wouldn't go away. That's when we knew something was really wrong. The doctors ran test after test but couldn't figure it out. We spent what felt like forever going back and forth to the hospital. Then, finally, we got the diagnosis, a rare form of cancer. Mom acted worried when people were watching, but when she thought no one could hear, I learned what she really felt. "It's just so exhausting," she whispered to her friends on the phone, pacing in the kitchen. "Do you know how many special meals I have to make now? And he's always home. I can't even leave the house without him asking where I'm going. It's like being in prison." I stood in the hallway, fists clenched, my blood boiling as I listened to her complain about taking care of her dying husband. But I never told Dad. He already had enough to deal with. He didn't need to know that his own wife saw him as a burden. For a year, Dad tried to keep things normal. He sat in his home office, making business calls between treatments, pretending the cancer wasn't eating away at him. I'd bring him tea and sit with him, watching him put on a brave face for his employees and clients. Then one day, he called Mom and me into his office. The moment I saw his face, I knew something was wrong. "I'm selling the business," he said, his hands folded on the desk. "The doctors, they told me I don't have much time left. Maybe a few months." It felt like all the air had been knocked out of me. "No, Daddy, no." The tears came instantly. I couldn't stop them. Dad reached for my hand. "Rachel, sweetheart, I need to do this. Neither of you can run the company after I'm gone. You're too young, and your mother, well, it's not her field. I won't let everything I built fall apart. At least this way, I can make sure you're both taken care of." Mom put on a show, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, pretending to cry. But I saw her checking her phone when Dad wasn't looking. Her tears were as fake as her designer handbags. The weeks that followed were brutal. Dad got weaker by the day. Every day after school, I rushed home, dropped my backpack at the door, and went straight to Dad's room. Sometimes I did my homework sitting next to his bed. Other times I just held his hand while he slept. During the day, the nurse, Mrs. Jeffrey, took care of him. She made sure he took his medicine and helped him eat.
But Mom?
She was barely around. When she did show up, she wrinkled her nose and complained about the smell in the house. "I just can't handle being here all the time," she told me one day, putting on lipstick in the hallway mirror. "The smell of sickness, it's everywhere. I need to get out to breathe." What she really meant was that she needed to go out, party, shop, and pretend her husband wasn't dying upstairs. When Dad got so sick that they moved him to the hospital, Mom stopped coming home at night. She would breeze in at dawn, looking far too happy for someone whose husband was dying. One morning, I couldn't take it anymore. "Where were you all night?" I demanded as she walked in, still wearing yesterday's clothes. "That's none of your business, young lady," she snapped. But I could smell the alcohol on her breath. "Dad is dying in the hospital, and you're out partying? How can you?" She grabbed my arm, squeezing hard enough to hurt. Her face was inches from mine, her perfect makeup unable to hide the anger in her eyes. "Listen to me very carefully," she hissed. "You will keep your mouth shut and show me some respect. Otherwise, I promise you, I will make your life a living hell. Don't test me, Rachel. You won't like what happens if you do." Dad died on a Sunday morning, exactly 1 week before my 19th birthday. I was holding his hand when he took his last breath. Mom? She was off getting coffee somewhere in the hospital. At the funeral, she put on quite the show. She wore a designer black dress and dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, accepting people's condolences in a trembling voice. "He was my everything," she kept saying. "I don't know how I'll go on without him." But the moment the last mourner left the cemetery, it was like a switch flipped. Her tears dried up instantly. In the funeral car on the way home, she was already checking her phone, smiling at text messages. The next week felt like a dream. I walked through school in a daze, barely able to focus. My friends tried to comfort me, but how do you explain to people your age what it feels like to lose your father while watching your mother act like she had just been set free? Then my birthday came. I didn't expect much for my birthday, but I thought Mom would at least say something. She didn't. I didn't even see her that day. She was gone before I woke up and still wasn't home by dinner. My friends took me to a small cafe downtown, bought me a cake, and tried to cheer me up. It helped a little. That night, I stayed over at my best friend Shirley's house. I didn't want to go home to an empty house on my birthday. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen and saw Mom with a man I had never seen before. He looked about 36, at least 16 years younger than her. He had his arm around her waist like he belonged there. "Oh, good, you're here," Mom said, sounding annoyed. "Rachel, this is Kevin, my fiancé." I froze, my coffee mug halfway to my mouth. "You're what?" "My fiancé," she repeated, slower this time, like I was stupid. "And now that you're here, we need to talk about arrangements." Arrangements? The word felt wrong in my mouth.
Yes.
"You need to leave." She smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Your father is gone now, and all his money is mine. I can finally live the way I want, with who I want." She squeezed Kevin's arm. "And that doesn't include having a teenager around." I stared at her. "You're kicking me out? This is my house too." I protested. "No, it's not." Mom marched upstairs and came back down, dragging my suitcase. She started throwing my clothes into it without even folding them. "You're 19 now. I don't have to take care of you anymore. I want you gone within the hour." "Mom, please. Don't mom me," she snapped, shoving more of my things into the suitcase. "I've done my duty. I raised you. Now it's time for me to be happy." I stood on the sidewalk with my half-packed suitcase, feeling completely lost. I had no grandparents, no aunts or uncles. Dad was an only child, and Mom's family had cut her off years ago, for reasons she never explained. With shaking hands, I called Shirley. The moment I told her what happened, she didn't hesitate. "Of course you can stay with me. My mom's been worried about you anyway." She actually said last night that she was afraid something like this might happen.
"Come over right now."
Shirley and her mom lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment across town. They set me up on their pull-out couch in the living room, bringing out their nicest sheets and even buying me new pillows. It wasn't much, but compared to being homeless, it felt like a luxury hotel. Shirley's mom hugged me tightly and whispered, "Stay as long as you need, sweetheart." The next week passed in a blur. I threw myself into my final exams, trying my best to keep my grades up, even though my world was falling apart. I stayed up late studying, not just because I needed to pass, but because it kept me from thinking about everything else. I had no idea what I was going to do after graduation. College felt impossible now that I had no home and no money. Every time I thought about the future, panic crept in. Then, I got a call from Mrs. Brandon, our old neighbor. "Rachel, honey," she said, her voice gentle but tense. "I thought you should know your mother is planning an engagement party at the house next weekend. She's going all out, catering, decorators, everything." My stomach twisted. An engagement party? Dad's been gone less than a month. His grave hasn't even settled yet. "I know, dear."
"I'm so sorry."
"I just thought you should know," she said, trailing off awkwardly. We both knew I hadn't been invited. I hadn't even been told. "It's absolutely shameful," she added, anger creeping into her normally sweet voice. For the next few days, I bounced between rage and sadness. How could Mom move on so quickly? How could she act like Dad never existed while I was still crying myself to sleep at night, still wearing his old sweater, because it smelled like him? She was planning a party to celebrate getting engaged to a man young enough to be her son. For days after Mrs. Brandon's call, my phone rang again. This time, it was a man who introduced himself as Paul Walker, a notary public. His voice was serious but kind. Something about it reminded me of Dad's business tone. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "I need you to come to my office as soon as possible. It's regarding your father's will. I've been handling some matters remotely, but this requires your presence." When I arrived at his office downtown, I was greeted by an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a warm, grandfatherly demeanor. The room smelled like old books and coffee, which was oddly comforting. He got straight to the point. "Your father made some very specific arrangements before he passed," he said, pulling out a thick folder and adjusting his glasses. "The house, all of its contents, and the entire proceeds from the sale of his business. Everything has been left to you, Miss Mitchell. I blinked in shock. Additionally, he continued, your father set up a trust fund just for your college education. He was very thorough in his planning. Then Mr. Paul reached into the folder and pulled out an envelope. Your father also left this for you, he said, sliding it across the desk. He was very clear that you should read it in private. With shaking hands, I picked it up. I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The moment I saw Dad's familiar handwriting, my eyes filled with tears. My dearest Rachel, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I'm so sorry I had to leave you, sweetheart. There's so much I wanted to see, your graduation, your college years, your wedding someday. But life doesn't always give us what we want. What I can give you, though, is protection. I need to tell you something difficult. I've known for a while about your mother's affair. I know about her lover, about her plans for my money after I'm gone. I've heard her on the phone many times, planning her future, a future that doesn't include you. I want you to understand, this isn't revenge. This is me protecting my daughter. You were the only one who sat with me through my illness, who held my hand without complaint, who loved me unconditionally. Your mother will get the car and the jewelry I bought her over the years. Those are hers. But everything else, the house, the money from my business, it's all yours. You can help your mother if you want to, but that's your choice to make. I just wanted to make sure she couldn't hurt you anymore. She won't be able to throw you out or take away your future. Love always.
Dad.
I clutched the letter to my chest, tears streaming down my face. Mr. Paul, sitting across from me, politely focused on organizing his papers, giving me a moment. When I finally found my voice, a question popped into my mind. Mr. Paul, why isn't my mother here for this? He cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. I tried to reach her several times. When she didn't answer my calls, I sent a formal letter about the reading of the will. She never responded. Of course, she hadn't. She was too busy planning her engagement party. Too busy with her new life to care about anything from her old one, including Dad's will. I left Mr. Paul's office in a daze, the folder of documents tucked under my arm, Dad's letter safe in my purse. When I got back to Shirley's apartment, I told them everything. Shirley hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, and her mom immediately grabbed her phone. This calls for a celebration, she said, opening a delivery app. I'm ordering from that fancy Italian place you girls love. Tonight, we celebrate justice being served. The day of Mom's engagement party arrived, exactly 1 month after Dad's funeral. I put on my best black dress, the one Dad had bought me for my last birthday, and carefully did my makeup. If I was going to crash this party, I was going to look good doing it. When I arrived, the house was glowing with lights, and cars lined the street. Music and laughter spilled out onto the lawn. The front door wasn't even locked. Mom never cared much about security. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. I walked right in. The living room was packed with people, mostly Mom's wine-drinking friends, all dressed up and holding champagne glasses. Kevin's friends were easy to spot, young, trying too hard to look rich. The decorations were flashy and over the top, just like everything Mom did. She had even taken down Dad's photos from the walls. Mom saw me first. The color drained from her face, but it quickly turned into anger. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, rushing toward me. "Get out.
Now."
Then she turned to her guests with a fake laugh. "Oh, everyone, this is my daughter. Poor thing just can't accept that she needs to stand on her own 3 feet now. She's here to beg to come home, but I have to be firm. Tough love, you know." Her friends giggled. Kevin's friends joined in. They all looked at me with that same smug mix of pity and judgment that rich people give to those they think are beneath them. I smiled. Not a friendly smile, the kind of smile a shark might give if sharks could smile. "Actually," I said, my voice loud and clear, "I'm here to take back what's mine." Mom laughed, mocking me. "Nothing here belongs to you anymore, dear. This is my house now." "No, Mom, it's not." I pulled the will from my purse and held it up. "This house belongs to me. So does everything in it. Dad left it all to me, the house, the money from his business, everything. You get to keep your car and your jewelry. That's it. The room went silent. Mom's face turned an interesting shade of purple. You're lying, she sputtered. Would you like to read it? I offered sweetly. Or should I call Mr. Paul, the notary, to confirm? Better yet, should I call the police to remove all these people who are currently trespassing in my house? The guests started moving immediately, grabbing their coats and bags, mumbling awkward excuses. No one wanted to be part of this disaster. Within minutes, the room was empty except for Mom and Kevin. Rachel, sweetie. Mom's voice turned sugary. We can work this out. We're family. Your father wouldn't want us fighting like this. I just shook my head and pointed to the door. You're right about one thing, Mom. Dad wouldn't want us fighting. That's why he made sure we wouldn't have to.
The door's that way.
Mom didn't go quietly. She never did anything quietly. You ungrateful little, she shrieked, her perfect makeup smudging as angry tears ran down her face. After everything I've done for you. Kevin stood awkwardly beside her, his eyes darting between her and the door like he was figuring out his escape plan. I noticed he had stepped away from her, no longer touching her. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Everything you've done for me? I repeated. Like abandoning me? When I was 10. When you complained about taking care of Dad while he was dying. When you threw me out the day after my 19th birthday. By now, the neighbors had gathered on the front lawn, drawn by Mom screaming. Mrs. Brandon was there, along with the Donald from across the street and the Mendezes from next door. They weren't even trying to hide that they were watching. This isn't over. Mom grabbed her designer purse from the couch. I'll get a lawyer. I'll contest the will. I shrugged. Good luck with that. Dad made sure everything was legally bulletproof. But hey, feel free to waste whatever money you have left on lawyers. And that's when I saw it, the exact moment Kevin's face changed. He looked at Mom like he was seeing her for the first time and didn't like what he saw. She wasn't the rich, glamorous woman he thought she was. She was a broke, aging woman with no house, no inheritance, and no way to get either. Janet, Kevin took a step back toward the door. Maybe we should take some time, to process all this. Mom's face crumpled as she realized what was happening. Kevin, baby, don't do this. We can figure something out. But Kevin was already halfway to his car. Mom chased after him, still shouting, but he didn't even look back. He got in and sped off, leaving her standing there, screaming into the night. And then applause. It's about time, Mrs. Brandon called out, coming up to hug me. Your father would be so proud of you, honey. One by one, the neighbors came up to offer their support. Mrs. Timothy brought over a casserole. You can't live on takeout forever. Mr. Donald and Melissa offered to help change the locks, just in case. Over the next few weeks, I heard bits and pieces about Mom through the neighborhood gossip. Kevin had dumped her immediately. Turns out, a woman with no money and no house wasn't what he had signed up for. She tried staying with her rich friends, but they were all suddenly too busy to help. One by one, they disappeared, just like Dad's money had. The last I heard, she had moved to Louisiana to live with a second cousin, the only family member willing to take her in. She called me a few times, leaving voicemails full of tears, apologies, and requests for money. I blocked her number. I graduated high school with honors, just like Dad always believed I would. In the audience, Shirley's mom and Mrs. Brandon sat in the family section, cheering louder than anyone. When I walked across the stage at graduation, I knew my future was secure because of Dad. The college fund he set up meant I could go to any university I wanted, so I chose his alma mater, a top business school on the West Coast. I'm studying business administration with a minor in agricultural studies. Maybe one day, I'll start my own company like Dad did. But for now, I'm just focused on building the life I want, one without Mom's toxic influence. And I know, without a doubt, that Dad's last gift to me was making sure I'd be okay.